Hey, Christine McDaniel here with the Co-Living Code, and today I have Robert Boyer on, and this is really exciting and different because we actually have somebody, he's actually an assistant professor he's at North Carolina, Charlotte, and he reached out to me. So he's actually does a lot of work in the co-housing space. So we're really gonna deep dive into that. You guys know that that's, people are using the words interchangeably. So I'm excited and he already knows that's going to be number one question I'm going to ask him is just to tell us the difference between co-housing and co-living, because we've heard that both words kind of used synonymously. And he has a lot of published research already on, in regards to co-housing. He's in the urban planning side of things on the education piece. So yeah, now we've got an educator on our show, which we're very grateful for. And so Robert, let me have you go ahead and kind of tell all of our audience and listeners more about, what you do, what you're up to, and then how you got into this field.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Christine. So I am a professor of urban planning in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. My research is mostly about urban sustainability, and I got into the field of co-housing and intentional communities while I was writing my dissertation. The short story is, while I was a graduate student, I visited Dancing Rabbit Ecovillage, which is in rural Missouri. It is a very inspirational community. They're living at levels of consumption that would be considered less than 1 Earth per person, right? They're consuming their fair share of resources, which is really rare in the United States. And I was absolutely fascinated with what they were doing. I thought, this is the answer, right? Or an answer about how we can live sustainably on the planet. Why aren't more people doing this? So that began my journey into understanding intentional communities, understanding why they're so hard to do, especially when it seems that they offer so many answers that urban planners and public leaders are interested in pursuing, especially with regard to the environment. And so ecovillages kind of naturally bled into co-housing, which is another form of intentional community. And recently I've gotten very interested in co-living as another form of collectivist living, or a way of living together and getting more out of being together than living in an isolated situation.
I love that. And I love that you use the word intention, right? Intentional living, because that's when somebody asks me the difference between co-living and just roommates.
Sure.
I said, well, co-living has a lot more intention to it. So a house might have a specific theme, like Kinderquarters, it's all entrepreneurs, or you might have all musicians. Like it's either done with a theme or just done with a lot of intention of like, hey, we're going to actually live collectively together.
Right.
When a lot of roommate situations, they've kind of live in the same house, but they have completely separate lives. To me, that's how I explain the difference between co-living and roommates. But I'd be curious to hear, if you have any other different thoughts on that.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. Intentional community is as old as the United States. There is a very long legacy of groups of people that decide to live together for a reason. You could even go back to the earliest colonies in the United States, when people moved over from Europe as a way to create a space where they could worship the way they wanted, or they could be free from burdensome taxes in the way they wanted. And so over the generations, there have been different waves of intentional communities, often in response to major societal trends. And it is really only since the early to mid 20th century that we have, as a society, created housing and created communities that cater to nuclear families as an isolated form of consumption. So today, it's very difficult to access housing that is not designed for isolated family living, right? Where it assumes that your economic and social world can be met in a single household with the people that you're immediately related to. That's the norm today, and hasn't always been so dominant throughout our history. We've had lots of different ways of living together. So this impulse to live together better is not new, but it has been dormant in the United States for a generation.
No, and that's so, and I do explain that to people too. I said, they're like, oh, it's the millennials doing this, or, because these are the people that are in their 40s and 50s, roughly age range. They don't understand it at all. And they're like, I would never do that. And I'm like, okay, you don't have to do it. That's fine. I go, but I'm telling you right now, these newer generations, and not just the millennials, but even Gen Z, they're more about the sharing economy, and they're more about, experiences over possessions. So what do you think? Is it just a generational shift, or like what triggered that shift?
I'm not sure that it's exclusive to a millennial generation. Because when co-housing, which is the one form of intentional community that I've studied a lot, is overwhelmingly older people. People that would be considered baby boomers, or and if you look at the average age of them, someone in Generation X would be a youngster in the co-housing movement. And so while it is a very rare movement, right, there's about 165 co-housing communities, established co-housing communities in the country. There are always more that are trying to get started. They're trying to attract people. And they often do, right? A very common story for co-housing startups is that they attract a whole lot of interest. Thousands of people express interest. They stop by, they pay an initial membership, right? A kind of a nominal membership so they can stay involved, and then it takes too long, or it becomes too costly. And the research that I've done has shown it's not that there's not an interest in this type of housing. It's just that the system is rigged against it. All of our financial structures, zoning and land use regulations, and just general marketing for housing is really not geared toward collectivist living or intentional community. So there are so many forces that work against this type of living that people usually say, you know what, it's too expensive, or it's going to take too long. I'll just do what's easiest. I won't go against the grain.
No, and Robert, I'm so glad you're talking about this too. So I met this amazing individual. They're probably in their mid 60s, and they're in San Diego, and I'm on their list now, and they have these meetings. So it's exactly what you're explaining. Monthly meetings of what they're going to build. And they even have these amazing documents that they've sent me that, this is our future plan. They've laid it all out, and you're right. So I think it's a lot of excitement, and it's like, okay, now it's all the steps to actually build it out. Because again, and then maybe we could dive right into that, is explaining the difference between co-housing, or what your definition, co-housing and co-living. I usually explain it in the sense that co-housing is usually sometimes the big plot of land, and they have each have their own individual homes, and then maybe they have a collective rec center or kitchen, or they share a lot of resources on that land. That's how I define it. Again, I'm not a professor, so maybe of urban planning, but yeah, I don't know if you had a different definition of that.
I think your description of co-housing fits a lot of what we see. There are a lot of co-housing follows what Chuck Durrett, who is a real pioneer, an architect, a pioneer in this field, calls the Danish model. Co-housing in the United States has its roots in Denmark, where you had individual homes. Sometimes it's share walled, so they're townhomes, but they're clustered on a piece of land around a common house. And everyone has kind of their own full home, right? You have your own kitchen, you have your own bedroom, and but what's stripped out of those homes often are the social spaces that you use once a year in a normal house, right? So most Americans, if they grew up in the suburbs, they lived in a home where there was that one room where you used it once a year, right? You used it a couple times a year. That is gone. Dining spaces are gone, but you still have your own complete home otherwise. And then you meet your neighbors in a common house and common recreational space. Not all co-housing is like that. There is some co-housing that looks more like a condominium or a multifamily housing, more like apartment dwellings. And it's in those types of co-housing that I think the co-living and co-housing really begin to blur. And there are some co-housing places that, they really resemble co-living to me. Although what I've observed is that co-living is much more oriented toward younger people that are in tech fields, right? They're digital nomads. And correct me if I'm wrong, right? And they're interested in being in a social space with people like them. And they may or may not live in these places forever, right? And in fact, I think there are some models where you can just skip around to all sorts of, if you're a subscriber to the service, and maybe that's what you run, but you can move around from different places. Co-housing is not built like that. Most people, they are committed to living in co-housing. They usually own their home, so they're usually committed there. They're going to stay there for a little while, and there's no such network where you can bounce around to different co-housing communities. So it's a little more sedentary.
Okay. Ooh, that's great. That really helps define it a little bit more even. You're right. They're not jumping around. And co-living, it's that flexibility. It's almost treating like housing as a service, right? Where it's a membership base. They could jump around,
Right.
Rome does a really good job of that outside. And same with ours, it's just like a 1 month minimum, if that. Sometimes we'll have people just for a week or two, because they are jumping around, but at the same time, they want to be around like-minded people. They want to co-live and have that network of like-minded people. And that's when co-living works really, really well. Okay, no, that's helpful. And because you literally lunch yesterday with a lawyer, we were just going, he's interested in the concept of co-living. And, but he's just like, well, Christine, what's the difference between, co-housing and co-living? And what if it's a house versus like an apartment community? Because, we've heard the term used for both. And so it's always fun. And I welcome that because it is such a new industry and we are trying to define it. So I'm like, okay, these are great questions, and then that's the next one for you, and this is the one I get more, oh gosh, I've gotten this question like 30 times in the last week, especially in like the investment and community, right? They're, again, and they don't know the industry at all yet. So co-living, what's the difference between co-living and roommates?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I could imagine that there are sets of roommates that could very well fit what I see as co-living. But I think from what I gather about co-living is there is a real intention and there is programming, right? That there is such an intention that you're going to live together, that there are organized activities, there are organized spaces, and you have decided that you're going to live in a place that is social, whereas roommates may or may not be just, I found someone that I can split the cost with, and we're just going to share this space until I find another place to live. So I know people that have roommates and they're very intentional with those roommates, and they've set up whole systems and whole programs within the complex that they share. But a lot of roommates I know, it's a matter of convenience, and then they split ways and they may never see each other again, and they just try and avoid each other in the kitchen and the bathroom. Whereas co-living, it seems like it's they're together by design, and also the design seems to fit this social space where you're able to get away, you have privacy, but then when you're outside of that private space, it's very easy to interact with people, and social interaction is very much encouraged.
Awesome. And then I know you've done like so much research, I'm sure, tons and tons when it comes to this stuff. Have you gone far back as far as tribes and how tribes were formed and how they operated? Is there any sort of translation to what we're trying to get back to, in your opinion?
No, I don't think I'm qualified to talk about, for example, indigenous groups or Native American living. But there are definitely roots, distant roots to early socialist utopias in the United States. Some of the earliest communes in the United States have their roots in early American communal living. Co-housing has distant roots in early American communal living. And it's been a very long time. So ideas of communal living and collectivism have kind of migrated all over the world. And as it happens, co-housing got its roots from Denmark most recently. But ecovillages and earlier in time, there are hippie communes, right? And a lot of people kind of have hippie communes in our collective memory. It's another form of intentional community. All kind of have their roots in in early American communal living and different philosophies. But I don't know specifically if there are any ties to Native American or other indigenous groups.
Yeah, and only because it's neat. What I say it works best when everybody's living together and there's like a common thread amongst everybody, but they're still, and everybody, like-minded,
Right.
but they're not identical. It's still,
Of course.
everybody brings different strengths to the home. So, somebody's good at this, somebody's good at that, but then maybe there's a common, thread amongst everybody. And I think that's how people could get along so well and relate with each other, because they have those commonalities, but then they still have different strengths they're bringing to the table, to the point where we're even, on the software we're building, we want to factor in, we're looking into the 5 love languages, Myers-Briggs, or maybe even creating our own of a personality test to see if there's a way that we can actually, somebody could fill something out, and see like, okay, here's your tribe. Like, this is the tribe that you're going to get along the best with. Again, this is way but what's funny is, when we started talking about, and this was my CTO was like, hey, what do you think, Christine, about the 5 love languages? Have you heard of it? And I go, it is so funny because every house in the last 2 years we've been in, we find out, we ask each other, hey, what's your love language? Like, because then again, you know how to relate to them a little bit better if they want, acts of service or quality time. It doesn't have to be a romantic relationship, because you're living in such close quarters. If you knew that about the person, you can relate even better and get along better living together. So
I think that face-to-face interaction and really beginning to know a person in real space and time is very important. And I think it would be ironic, I think, if an online test, having never met someone, would determine what in-person community you end up in.
I know, right? Again, we're toying with the idea.
Yeah.
Because it's
and that's both a cost and a benefit to intentional communities. What I've observed with co-housing and eco-villages, one of the reasons it's so difficult to get these things started is because you have to decide who you're going to live with and collaborate with for potentially for a very long time. And so there are absolutely differences in personality and differences in preferences that can get in the way of forming a community. And then later on, there can be a clash of personality and clash of priorities once a community is already founded and someone comes in. If they don't agree with those priorities, well, if it's a community built around them, then they're probably not going to fit in. So it's really important that a community has its priorities clear. And I think also, to your point, if everyone that joined a community was exactly the same and brought in the exact same skills and the exact same ideas, that sure would be a boring and pretty weak community, in my opinion. They'd be stuck doing one thing, and so I think that a community can both have a lot in common and be diverse, and those are the strongest ones that endure for a long time.
And then have you seen it more successful when there's an actual like appointed, I don't know if you want to use the word leader or whatever, just that point person to kind of manage, somebody to go to? Have you seen that more successful?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because that one of the defining properties of co-housing is that it's a non-hierarchical decision-making structure, which means that, there may be a person that's in charge of facilitating meetings, but there is no one person with a veto, no single person, right? So there are lots of, for example, a lot of big decisions in co-housing and in eco-villages are made by consensus.
Cool.
Consensus takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of skill. And so the best communities that I've visited are actually the members practice. They get training in how to participate in making a decision, which is something that very few people in the United States do today. And I think that's why we see a lot of breakdown in dialogue, especially in the political and public realm, is that, we're all very new. We're all very nervous about letting our opinion get known. And we tend to have very, strong emotional reactions. And then strong emotional reaction is fine. But then you have to, as a co-participant in that discussion, try and isolate someone's emotional reaction from the content of the decision. That's really hard to do, right? People like to react emotionally and take things very personally. And so we have to go through training to learn how to make productive decisions in spite of our differences. Most of us don't know how to do that.
No, and you're right. I mean, even the very first home, there was one person like leading the meetings and, but we did it consensus every time, if we wanted somebody to move in, it had to be a consensus. We had to have a conversation around the dinner table, go over the pros and cons and and I agree. I think that works best to have that set up. Because you still want somebody to lead everybody, right? To lead stuff.
Yeah. There has to be some agreement about how decisions are made. Maybe it's faster if someone is just assigned to make a decision, or someone is paid, right? Someone is paid to decide how cleaning gets done. But in co-housing, which I think this is one difference that I see in co-living and co-housing, is that in co-housing, all the yard work, all the cleaning work, that's done by the people living there. So they work together to maintain their own community. My understanding with co-living is that sometimes they'll hire someone to get that done. And so that's another big difference.
Okay, no, love it. And then where do you see, again, and you've been kind of, working on this for a while, where do you see the industry of co-living going as a whole?
Well, I can't keep up with all the new co-living, right? It just seems to be growing extremely fast. This is different. I'm not used to having studied co-housing and ecovillages. I'm not used to seeing headlines every day about new communities. The fact that it is driven by developers and seems to have found a niche that is within the mainstream real estate market is optimistic for the movement. I think that it's going to grow. There are a lot of people that I know are interested in collective living. When I describe this to people of all ages, either they themselves or someone they know is interested in ways that we can live together better. And earlier we were talking about millennials versus older generations. I think that there are applications for this that are especially good for widowed individuals, right? People that have lived together for a long time with someone and then lose that company. That there could be a social living space with opportunities to interact with other people, yet you're still independent. Seems to me like an amazing model.
No, I agree. Yeah. I agree. That excites me because they don't want to go into like a senior home, like a facility of some sort. They want to still live their lives, but then they don't want to be lonely. So they want to live collectively, share resources, help each other out, and I've talked to people, in that age range where it's like, they can, to have an on-site nurse come in once a day, and help everybody versus, the cost would be ridiculous if it was just for one person. That excites me.
So I see right now, like you described, a lot of co-living seems to be populated by millennials, by young tech workers, and I think that that model is really conducive to that lifestyle. And I also think that once it takes off and gains more publicity, that a broader demographic will say, well, how can I make this work for me? And that'll be exciting to see whether and to what extent co-living expands to more demographics and more types of places. Because right now my observation is that it's mostly in high rent markets, places where it's very expensive to rent an apartment otherwise, especially if you're just out of school. But I'm really excited to see whether it will expand to more places, and to both suburban and urban places.
And so do you think, and honestly, I know you're not going to answer not truthfully, but answering honestly, like, because I hear this recently too. Oh, it's a
Mhm.
trend. Oh, it's just a fad. It's just a trend. It's going to disappear. And I'm like, I have this on Google Alerts. I have co-living
Right,
on
right.
Google Alerts, and you're exactly right. Every single day, the amount of articles, the amount of new development, I mean, it's insane. It's like wildfire. And I'm like, I don't think it's going to just disappear.
I don't
Um,
think so either. I think you're right. And I think the data that convinces me of that is the percentage of households in America that are don't fit the mold of housing that has traditionally been built in America, right? So our housing model in the United States, right, something like about 70% of homes built every year are single family homes, right? Detached single family homes. And that housing model was built with a nuclear family in mind. The nuclear family is still or rather, a household headed by a married couple. That's still about 50% of households in the United States, but it used to be 80%, right? 80% of households after World War II, or close to 80%, were headed by a man and a woman that were married. And that is just not so common anymore. And the housing market will begin to adjust to that. And I think co-living is one of those. I imagine that it is not a trend. This is something that will be around and it will grow.
Well, I am so excited, Robert. You have a PhD. Like, I am glad you're here with these. You can actually bring some facts behind, and some data. Well, you have the data and you have the numbers,
Right,
and
right,
it's
right, right.
like, and that's nice because, I get these questions asked and I'm like, okay, I need to actually have the data behind it to really justify, like, no, this is why. I mean, I could go off my gut all day long, but most people want facts behind it. So I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, we have two experts that are very great and amazing at Wikipedia, trying so hard because, and you probably already know this, co-living is under co-housing on Wikipedia.
Oh, I didn't
And
know that.
yeah. And so we're trying really hard, to just say, well, actually they're different. They're not
Yeah.
the same. We've been working on that for months. So
Yeah.
y'all,
So you and I intuitively know that these things are different. But something that I'm working on right now is conducting a survey of co-living residents, and to really get the data to understand what motivates individuals to move into co-living, what they do when they're inside, and then how they interact with the larger world, right? Politically, how they engage civically with the world outside of their community. And we have data from one of my colleagues at the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. We're going to compare the same answers to people living in co-housing and in condominiums. And so we're going to have the data to show whether or not these two things are different. We're open to the possibility that they're exactly the same. My guess is that we're going to see some real differences in the data, and that we'll be able to get back to you and to the co-living community about what makes co-living today different. And it may change, right? This movement is growing so fast that what we see today may be completely obsolete in a few years. At
great.
least for us.
No, and I love it. And that's the no. And I already given him my word that I'm getting the survey out to the co-living community. Promise
Right.
we're going to get survey results, because that's exactly, he reached out to me to say, hey, how do I get the survey out into their hands? How do we get it filled out? It's like, hey, I mean, we would love to see the data and the results. So that's definitely the project we're working on together. So we'll get that, and we'll find out what the data says, right?
Yeah, I'm excited to see.
Yeah. So thank you so much. And yeah, when he reached out for the survey, I go, yeah, of course I could do that. I would be happy to. But I'm like, but I would love to get you on my show in the meantime. So
Right.
Robert, thank you so much for spending the time today. I really appreciate it. I know everybody watching and listening to this will appreciate it too, just to get kind of more facts, more data, and just getting it. We've never had somebody from the educational side come in on this topic. So I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Christine. Have a good one.
You too. Thanks. Have a great day.